Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you how to replace the struts on a 2006 4Runner. There's a few videos out there showing you how to do this, but there's some tips and tricks that I learned while I was doing this. This is the first time I've done this job, and so I thought maybe this would be useful for some of you who aren't mechanics and are thinking about doing a job like this. Really, it's not that difficult. It took me about probably an hour and a half, 2 hours to do each side. I did have a Daystar, 2.5 and a 1.5 inch lift on the 4Runner. So I had the 1.5 inch spacers in the front. So I measured the driver's side after I put the KYB strut in. I was going to leave the spacer in, but it seemed like it was just pretty hard to get the lower control arm connected. So I decided to not put the spacer back on. And once I got that done, I measured the driver's side and the passenger side, and it measured almost identical. But the passenger side with the blown out strut, I mean, it was sagging. And so really it's not the ideal situation. I am a little worried that if I were to put the spacer back on, that I would be stretching it a little bit too far. I measured the back, so I have the 2.5 inches on the back, and now the back sits about 1.5 inches high. And I think the front end will sag after it wears out a little bit or wears in. So there is a chance I'll put the spacers back in. I'm curious if any of you have done this and you have the spacers up front, if you put them back on and how high it was afterward. But I was a little worried that it would be too high and put too much stress on my CV axle. All right, so I'm gonna show you how I'm gonna swap out these struts on my 2006 4Runner. I think one thing that I want you to know is, if you look here, I have a Daystar spacer. I was going to show you, but I took the wheel off already. I already replaced the other side, the driver's side. What I'm replacing them with are these KYBs. You can see the part number. They actually lift the 4Runner about the same as my spacers. So on this side, you can see, here's the spacer. I took the spacer off my driver's side, and I measured the distance from the ground to about here, and it was identical with the new KYB struts and my old blown out struts that I'm replacing them with the spacer. So I am going to leave the spacer off for now and see how I like it, and if I want them, I'll put them back on. But really, this shouldn't be a hard job, and I'll show you some tricks that I've learned. The first thing, just to be aware, you have to take off these 3 nuts. The one back here, do not touch this one in the middle. So it's just these 3. This one in the back is a pain. I know a lot of people online will say that you can reach it from inside the engine compartment, but really I just got a crescent wrench and or just an open-ended wrench, and I just slowly got it a quarter turn at a time. So anyway, you have to take these 3 bolts off, or nuts, and then on the other side I took this nut off. You obviously have to disconnect, take this nut off, and and then the last 2 things are, if you can see, make sure you can see, so these 2 bolts off that are connected to my ball joint. So those are the things, so there's 1, 2, so there's one on the other side of the ball joint here, and then we have, let's see, where's my hand, right here. Okay, so we have to take this nut off. So there's 3, potentially 4. You can see that this is blown out. I should replace that. I don't have a new one right now, so I'm not going to. And then 4, 5, 6. So we'll see how that goes. I have some things that I learned when I was doing the other side that should be pretty useful for getting the lower control arm out of the way, which I think is the biggest struggle that I had on the other side. Another thing to notice is that when you're looking in here, you'll see a ton of grease. There's grease all over the place, And I think a lot of it is because my boot here on my CV is leaking. I think it's torn, and so all the grease when I'm in 4-wheel drive is just flinging all over the place. Another thing to be aware of too is when you're looking at your ball joint, I think mine's looking pretty bad too. It's a little greasy as well. You can see up here. So you definitely want to take a look and see if your ball joints are in good condition, because in my opinion, these are one things that you do not want to go out almost more than anything on your vehicle. When you're driving down the freeway at 80 miles an hour, you don't want your whole wheel falling off. So I would take a look at that while you're in there, but I'll show you what I'm gonna do. First, I'm gonna take off these 3 nuts, and then I'll do the lower control arm down here with the ball joint, and then I'll take the strut off, and then I'll take this off, and we'll see how it goes. I finally got the nuts off here. This one back here definitely will test your patience. Really just used, let's see, just come back here, the nut, and slowly turn until it's really about like that. It's not fun. Okay, piece of advice. I just undid the ball joint right here, the lower control arm, and when I did that, this whole assembly up here bounced upwards. So make sure your face and arms and body are away from the assembly when you're undoing those 2 big bolts here on the bottom, because they'll separate and spring away from each other. And then I'll show you what I'm going to do here. You see, I just have a punch, and I'll go and put the punch on here and just use a hammer and tap the bolt out that's holding the lower part of our strut. And then I think we'll be close to getting it out. All right, so once you have all those bolts undone, I know a lot of videos they'll say to undo, at least loosen up the lower control arm there. That way you can swing out. And I did that on the other side, and it's still way too stiff. So I'll show you what I did. I did not loosen them on this one, and I gotta come along and I connected it to the lower control arm. Then I used a hook from a strap, just a ratchet strap, and put it in this hole in that other lower control arm. So I connected my come along into there, pull my lower control arm out of the way. I say be very careful. It takes a ton of force to get it down, and once it's down like that, there's a little bit more favorable angle to hold that lower control arm in place, but initially there's just not a ton of angle. So it takes quite a bit of force to get it down. So this is a part you need to be really careful with. You want to make sure that hook doesn't disconnect over here. But I think this is probably one of the faster ways to do it, to get that lower control arm out of the way if you have a come along. Okay, and now that we have that lower control arm out of the way, really all I need to do is, if you grab this whole assembly here and push it that way, so if you were to swing it out of, it opens up the axle, gets out of the way, and it should just drop right out into this hole here. So it's pretty easy at that point. You just slide it out, and once we get this out, I mean it already is, I just need to move it out of the way, and it's time to put the new one in. All right, so I got the new one in. It really is easy. And one thing to be aware of, we want to make sure that it's lined up. So it has to be lined up so it can fit right here in these grooves, and it really can only go one way. That's something I was wondering about, but the bolt pattern on the strut is such that it really can only be mounted one way. So don't worry too much about that, but just make sure when you get it in there that that this is lined up so it's going to fit into that groove. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to slowly release the come along until the lower control arm comes up, and hopefully I can just do it enough to where it's lined up perfectly here with my strut. All right, so I'll show you what I did to bring that lower control arm up. I saw videos that people would use a jack and try to jack the lower control arm up right here. So maybe like put a jack just like right here, push it up. But I did that earlier on the other side, and all I ended up doing was lifting the car up. And really what we also want to do is to pull this lower control arm down. So I came up with the idea of just using a ratchet strap. I go around this upper control arm, and I go around. You really want to be careful that you're not putting the strap on any of your brake lines. So I went behind my brake line here. There's my hand right here. So I went behind it. So you go over my upper control arm, and then it goes down and around underneath my lower control arm right here, and then back up. So you also want to be careful that it doesn't put too much stress here on your CV boot, because you don't want to rip that if you don't want to replace your CV axles anytime. But since mine are also torn, I'm not as concerned about it. But really here, I'm not putting, let's see, it's not really too much force on there. But anyway, it works pretty easy. It's not too hard just to pull and lift those together. So right now I'm going to put the bolt in here for the lower control, or for my strut. And one thing to be aware of, I'm sure most of you or some of you thought about it when I was doing it, but you know, I used a punch to get this out, and it might be hard to tell here, but I did mess some of the threads up closer into here. I don't think it will be that big of a deal, but I would say be careful with what, maybe you can see it. Be careful about doing what I did, because you can mess the threads up. I think that's the biggest trick right there. So now that I have that in, I'll put this bolt in, and then I will snug it just a little bit more so I can get this in focus for you. I've got to get this lined up with here so I can put the ball joint back in. And really that's the hardest thing. Getting those to line up is a pain. But with this ratchet, I can even show you, if I were just to crank it a little bit, you can see how it just doesn't take too much effort. I'm just using a couple fingers and pulling that in. All right, just a quick tip. I moved the strap from this groove to just this part right here on the lower control arm. And that's just because it was getting a little too tight here on my boot. And putting it just down here gave me a little bit more space. And it's kind of slanted in right here, the boot is, so I had a lot more space to wiggle it around without messing my boot up. But really it was a pretty simple process. Got my nut on, and even after pounding it out, it came on really nice. So meaning that when I pounded out, you know, I flattened some of the threads, but that didn't seem to affect anything. And I got the bolts on here on my lower control arm. That was actually not too bad. The nice thing about using the strap is that it still allows me to move this whole wheel assembly around, and still can pivot around and get everything lined up. So really, I think that's the way to go. I've seen so many people online who are disassembling so many things they don't have to, like taking the whole sway bar off and the sway bar linkage here, but I didn't even touch that, and it seemed to come on pretty easily. So yeah, I hope this has been helpful for you.